Jennifer Moss, thank you so much for making time for us. What's the crack? How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much. It's really great to be here and to talk with you guys today. It's going to be a great conversation.
Absolutely, I'm really looking forward to it. Me and Seb have kind of had alternative perspectives from the working from home life, and yeah, I guess I've been following your work when I guess I started to experience this what I think was burnout, which we'll get into. First of all, though, just to give our listeners a bit of perspective, can you tell us a bit about yourself and how you came to be working in this area?
Yeah, so I've been working in workplace culture, and actually I was a happiness expert when this all started. Part of the Global Happiness Council, looking at research and data that analyzed how workplaces are connected when they're connected to well-being, how that actually translates in higher productivity and just overall goals that organizations are going to meet. So there's these win-wins, and did a lot of interventions and work with organizations. I mean, at the beginning, it was Lululemon. We were their happiness, ambassadors or experts. So it was a really interesting job. But what I came to understand is that there's a small portion of organizations kind of in this special realm that are the best places to work, that they are the places where they support well-being and they're doing burnout prevention right, and we're at optimization levels. So encouraging employees to participate in self-care makes sense because it's not tone deaf because they're doing all the other things right. But as I started to really dig into to other organizations, I found that not a lot of companies were doing that very well, that they were basically not even meeting hygiene, and so there was a lot of burnout. And so I joke about moving from an unhappiness or a happiness expert to an unhappiness expert, in my last decade. And so the last, 4 or 5 years has been really focused on understanding the chronic stress that leads to burnout in organizations and figuring out how to fix that.
That's a fantastic summary. um, I guess for listeners who maybe I think they know what burnout is, can you give us like a clear definition? They think, oh, I've experienced it, or my friend had it, but or maybe they don't even know they have it. That's a question that I'm interested in. Do you think people can have burnout and not really think they have it?
Well, I'm going to start with the first question. What is burnout? And according to the World Health Organization, they've actually redefined the term in 2019, which was a major move by them because experts have been really pushing them to make changes to that definition. They inserted it into their international classification of diseases, and they didn't necessarily go as far as saying it was a medical condition, but they did identify it as an occupational phenomena. So workplace stress left unmanaged. And that's important because we tend to think of burnout in lots of different ways. The etymology of the word, you think 80s teen movies where Judd Nelson is walking across, waving his hand, and taking too many drugs and dropping out of school. So when you actually try to, as an expert, a researcher in burnout, try to get people off of that way of thinking, the WHO helped with that quite a bit. And so when you look at the root causes of burnout, they're highly systemic. They're, legacy of work. So overwork and workload and unsustainable workload is one of the biggest, which we saw a lot of this year. But we're also looking at things like values mismatch and roles mismatch, and just feeling like you're micromanaged constantly, that feeling like you have no control. Inequality and even just fairness is a big part of it. And this year we saw a lot of that polarization where people that were dealing with racism at work and ageism, and we see that in gender discrimination. So these are things when you actually look at burnout. These aren't things that can be solved with self-care. These are massive infrastructure and policy issues that need to be changed in the workplace, and then employees can show up, safe and psychologically safe at work.
Beautiful. And do you think that people can be burnt out for a long period of time and maybe because of the work environment where their colleagues are experiencing something similar, that they think it's normal, and they don't really think that there's a burnout per se. They just think this is what happens when you are working, like this is the feeling you have.
Absolutely. So we're seeing a lot of conversations around that. Like I said, legacy of overwork in industries like healthcare. Tech is, widely known for the, Elon Musk statement around working 80 hours a week, solves these big problems. And that's important because we have this expectation of people that becomes culturally, assimilated. We just saw the Citibank announcement and the Goldman Sachs announcement that, that they're going to start to do Zoomless Fridays and we need to deal with overwork. But then you talk to anyone in those institutions and they basically say, that's great, but it doesn't mean I'm not going to work 60 or 70 hours a week. And so that's the problem. It's just so culturally accepted that what happens is that nothing changes. So it needs to start really, way before, you get into a leadership position where the junior associates don't feel like they have to be hazed, in those first years of starting a job. There's a lot of that, and tech is the same way with life on site and these other, institutionalized ways of thinking about overwork, and then it becomes just part of the expectation.
Sorry. Jen, do you think we're guilty of glamorizing this overworking? Because often when I listen to people who are, incredibly successful, and like you said, Elon Musk is a great example there of the working 8 hours a week, and it's always painted as like the hustle, and this is what's needed to do to get to these certain, these places in life, and if you're not doing this, then you're lazy, and you're never going to amount to anything, you're a loser. And if we are glamorizing it, how do we go about changing that without them becoming the lazy person, the loser, the person who has no dedication and has no will to succeed?
That's a really important question because, again, it's just, it's become a social construct. It's become a cultural construct inside of these organizations that makes it almost like turning, the Titanic away from the iceberg. And it is considered to be cool. I mean, Ariana Huffington went around and talked about how important sleep is and how she thinks other CEOs that claim that they only got 4 hours of sleep last night are lame. And, we have to start kind of having those conversations. But there's, you really do need the highest level leadership and influencers to talk more openly about that. You see, Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand, now Prime Minister of New Zealand, talking more about empathy and compassion and thinking differently about workload, the 4-day work week. We need more policy. We need more governmental influence there. We need laws, around overwork, because if not, then it's so hard to change. I mean, if you want to be that person that really is standing up for your, your well-being, and you have every single person around you that thinks and knows that if they don't do that kind of work, that they're not going to get promoted, then that's a there's no way that you can sustain that. So leaders have to start celebrating the behaviors and modeling the behaviors that they want to see in their people. That means they have to commit to 40-hour work weeks. Anything over 45 hours is actually just completely lost productivity. You cannot actually do more work. If you do 60 hours of work, you might as well have worked 45 because you're just burning calories. You're not being more productive. And there's lots of really great research out of Stanford that has followed along on people working these extreme hours, and they're not actually developing or doing more, innovating more than if someone worked 45. So it really is just getting the facts out there and the evidence out there, but managers have to be really clear about expectations and creating the environment that they want to see. We see too many leaders put on this sort of stoicism hat, and then they say, don't worry, I can do the work while you go ahead, and I'm not going to take vacation because I'm the boss, but you should. I mean, that doesn't help, because you can't be what you can't see. And so we need to start seeing more of what the possibility is versus, I'm over here on a silo, but, you go ahead and take that vacation. Oh, but maybe we won't promote you if you do. Those are the dangers that I see, still existing right now.
It's really I'm glad that you brought up the point of like diminishing returns and the potential 4-day week, because something I wanted to bring up, that I currently live in Madrid, in Spain. I mean, I hope to live here for a long time, but they've recently said that they're going to extend a countrywide, a nationwide test to see if they can implement a 4-day week. And to start with, that would just be for maybe 200 companies. I think they said, which will be able to opt in, and then if it works, then maybe they'll try to in time roll that out nationwide. Obviously, it's something that I'm all for. But I mean, in Spain, the kind of, at least in my sector, which is the tech industry, the majority of companies work half-day Fridays, so 9 till 3, which is at least something. But I wonder, do you think the 4-day week has any promise, any future there? I read that it helped. There's a company that uses it in Spain already, that they've implemented it just on their own accord, and they found that it really increases productivity amongst their workers. And like you said, you get rid of the kind of the dead hours, people just using there to waste time, and the workers are far happier working that 4-day week. Do you think that this is something that we could see not just in Spain, but maybe even worldwide in time?
I'm absolutely optimistic about that concept of the 4-day work week. I know even Microsoft has tested it in Japan with their employees there, and certain markets, especially where, Japan is an example of where burnout is extremely high, and a lot of unhappiness and loneliness in that country that's associated with workload and overwork. And so they did test that in their Japanese offices, and they found that it was highly successful. The data has come back that it was really, really great. Feedback. I know in New Zealand, there's been some conversations about it. We've talked about it in Canada too. I know Trudeau the Prime Minister has mentioned that there's some potential opportunity to have a test around that. So I think, what I think is the greatest sign is when government comes in and they decide to make that test with corporate, where there's an alignment there, where it isn't just, one company decides to make that decision and then another company, chooses not to. Because what happens is then it starts to be a perk. And perks are great, but they're not necessarily going to change much. Like, for example, there's some great companies in Silicon Valley that are doing things like mat leave and paternity leave. And in the US, for example, that paid family leave or time off to have a child it's the only OECD country that doesn't offer any sort of financial protection if you take time off. And so it becomes a perk where you have maternity and paternity leave, where that should just be table stakes. And in any country, there needs to be certain standards that are expected, and it isn't like you are drawn to one company because you're getting access to a fundamental right. And I think we really need to start thinking about our mental health, our our happiness at work, our well-being at work, to be a fundamental human right. And once you start to think about it that way, and the government sets an infrastructure around that, like France actually made it illegal to send emails after 6. We have to have accountability, and I think that's when you really see big shifts happen and big changes happen.
Jen, you mentioned the robust research about how over a certain amount of hours per week is just not productive. Can I ask, why do you think there is still such loyalty amongst many companies to say, oh no, just the 60, 70 hours, yeah, you're a hard worker, we need to do this?
Because fundamentally, and what we learn in business school, is that relationships between employers and employees are transactional. I hire you to do a job, and that's the expectation. And there's still sort of an antiquated, indebted servitude expectation from employees to employers. And so I, as an employer, can ask to you to do whatever I want you to do. And if you don't do it, there's another person that will fill that job. And so, that when there's human-centered leadership and there's an expectation that it's a symbiotic relationship where I want to motivate you and make this a healthy place, and I believe in the data that it will actually make us more productive. That's really, that's a really great two-way relationship. But we still have a lot of changing in how leaders are taught to think about how they're going to run their business. And in most business schools, you're still being told that this is how you should run your company. And again, it's profit margin, and the metrics that we define as success in an organization should be aligned with well-being. It should be aligned with mental health. And they're not in the same way. When we look at, shareholder value, that should be associated with, the well-being value. There should be some sort of well-being quotient that is attached to organization success metrics, and that isn't there yet. So until it's not entirely transactional, then we're still going to see this culture of overwork and just easily replaced workforce.
I would love to see, or I'd love for it to become commonplace for people to be investing companies based on how they treat their employees or how happy the employees are. Um, one question I also wanted to ask was, I recently read a book called Bullshit Jobs. I don't know if you're familiar with it. An author from Dave Grohl, yeah. And I wonder, have you come across any research between the relationship between burnout and a kind of indifference a significant proportion of the population feel towards their jobs?
Absolutely. There was a recent massive Gallup data that, and it was millions of data, tens of millions of data points. And it found that 94% of the population that they surveyed in Japan, 94% of them hated their jobs, like literally hated their jobs. And the global workforce, it was roughly 85% of people hated their jobs and hated their managers. And like hated was the word. And so that's a problem when currently our engagement is about 50% or 15% of the global workforce is engaged and 85% is not. There's a giant group in the middle that are just showing up to work. So there's just, that where there's no purpose or meaning, but they go to work and it's okay. They don't really care, but they don't also feel horrible about it. But then there's, a large group in certain parts of on the continent and, in the world that actually hate how they feel when they go into work. And so this is a big problem. In North America and Europe, we're seeing more about 30%, but still that's 70% of the workforce that's just disengaged in work. And that's a problem. And so it's been a big, rationalization for my work, and part of why I'm so passionate and why I find meaning in it is because we spend 115,000 at work, in our life. That's how many hours we spend at work in our lifetime. 50% of our waking hours is spent at work. And yet there's only 15% of people across the globe that feel engaged. We need to do better because our mental health and our well-being when it comes to work, it's so critical. It plays such a role in our happiness when it's good, when we have harmonious passion in work. It is like super fuel. We feel so excited about our work. It's engaging, it's exciting, it spills over into our lives. It's a wonderful feeling to love what you do. And then we need to, on the flip side, when it's stressful and and detracting from our happiness and it's burning us out, it can spill over into our relationships, into our, physical experience of life. It reduces our lifespan. It gives us heart attacks. I mean, there's a huge impact on us when our work is unhappy. And so, for sure, there's sort of some sad stats that need to change around how people feel about work.
Those stats are really quite alarming, but for all the wrong reasons. I would probably say that I'm in that that group that feels apathetic towards their work. But luckily for me, I have a boss she's just incredible, and she's always made sure that we don't work over hours, and she's actually really on mental health. And but that, I'm not sure if it comes from the top down. I think it kind of starts from her, to be honest. So I count myself lucky that I have her as my boss, because I think if I didn't, I might fall into that percentage that say they hate their job. Because I think that can be the difference, right? I wonder. I've got like a two-part question. I think so. Jim and I are millennials, and I've got a sister who I think would be classed as Generation Z. And I think we've grown up, a lot of us have seen our parents, like you said, either apathetic or hateful towards their jobs. And the idea of loving your job kind of felt like something for the lucky few. But in reality, that's not something you strive for or even really dream about, because it's not going to happen to you, right? I wonder how do we go about making that change? Like, how do we change it from being a thing where, oh, it's only the really lucky ones of us are going to get something that we really love. The rest of us have to just churn it out and just do what we need to do. How do we bring that change?
That's a really excellent question. And what we found even in our data this last year with millennials and Gen Zs in the workforce, they're the most hard hit from a mental health and well-being standpoint from the pandemic. We talk a lot about parent burnout and, and the juggling demands. But if you're in the millennial group, your well-being is significantly low in most cases. I know that Seb, you mentioned that you're doing pretty good, but there's a lot of people that in this group that are feeling like their careers are on hold. They feel like they're not making any headway. After 2008, with the economic crisis, what happened was more young people went back to school and got these, additional qualifications, which made them again overqualified for the jobs that they're in. So, which makes them, less happy as well in their jobs. And then we're seeing that now from this next sort of economic crisis, more people going back to school, which is making them more qualified. And then they're, unhappy because they're not really doing what they want. They don't feel connected. And in those early stages, that first 10 years of work, there's a lot of control of your work. You're more likely to be micromanaged. You don't get to have agency and choice. When we saw, in the data, is that the higher you were in the organization, the more sort of prophylaxis you had to burnout. Even though there's a lot of executive burnout, there's just more choice. You have more ability to kind of make the decision about what you want to do. And I sort of liken it to our experience as, grade school kids, and then into high school, you get a little bit more connected to a tribe. And then, you go into post-secondary, and then you get to be a little bit more specialized. I think the reality is that we are sort of, when you go back to school, go into your first year of work, it's like going back into kindergarten again, or grade one. You're sort of starting at that initial phase where everything is out of your control. And so part of that, I think, is really being good at mapping to what your goals are. And job crafting is what I honestly constantly suggest for people. And I have this example, which I really love. And the researchers that sort of founded that term or co-authored that term did this study within hospitals, and they found that there were this one group that were really highly retained. They took very few sick days. They described loving their jobs. And this other group that were just the same group in the same role hated their work. They were miserable. And what they found was that there was this one part of the group, they were asking them, like, how do you describe your job? And there was one group that described their job because they were all cleaning the hospital, and it was in a certain ward where there were many of their patients in vegetative states. They were in a coma, and what they described their job as being like very tactical. Like, I go in and I wash the floors and I move the paintings around, or I, adjust the flowers, or, I clean the beds and, basic stuff, right? That a cleaner in a hospital would do. But then there was this other group, and they called themselves the patient ambassadors. And they saw that their role had this purpose in it. So they felt like the way that they adjusted their paintings would help heal their patients. Whenever that they tucked their patients in and changed the flowers, that it would maybe help them come out of a vegetative state. And when they did, they would know that they were loved and cared for. They, chose to do other things that weren't part of their job, like sing to the patients or play music for them. And so when you think about your job, it's so important to think about it in a way where those tasks that seem useless or mundane or meaningless, we have to give them meaning to change why they matter into the overall goal. We need to map to our bigger expectations. Where do we want to be in this? When we get out of kindergarten and, or we get into high school, stage in our careers, where do we want to be focused? Do we want to be focused in this space? Do we want to be on a leadership track? Do we want to remain an individual contributor? Do we want to maybe think about being an entrepreneur? What are those ways that we can take the tasks that we do every day to give them meaning so they map to larger goals? And that's hard to do, obviously, when we're working hard and we're burned out. But the same amount of hours these people were working, the same experience that they were having every day, and the mindset is really critical to how we have very healthy careers, especially in those early stages. And it also makes us just love our work more. And when you think about what is the goal, it's your own experience of work and your love of what you do that is going to change how well you are. And so that plays a critical role. We aren't going to ask an employer to be responsible for our happiness. We're going to ask them to be responsible for not detracting from our happiness. So our job is to show up in a way that makes the most of what we can control. And I think that gives, young people that are at work a little bit of agency, a little bit of choice, and that helps to kind of not feel like you're so controlled in the environment.
I've got a question here, and it might sound controversial given what you've just said, but I wonder if we put too much meaning on jobs in terms of our own pride, our own sense of identity. I said that before, that I was kind of apathetic towards my job, but I don't think that kind of detracts from me as a person. I just understand I moved to Spain, I had no contacts, I found a job in this sector, got headhunted, and now it seems that my CV has been geared towards a sector when it really was just kind of a lucky few steps. It wasn't a plan by any means. And maybe someone could argue, well, you've created this podcast to kind of make up for that lack of meaning in your job. And there might be something to that argument. But I wonder, a lot of us, I feel like we put our whole identity hangs on what our job is, and maybe the amount we earn, maybe the company we work for, if it's a real big name that everyone respects automatically, the profession, a lawyer, everyone automatically kind of drops their jaw at you. And I wonder if we kind of somewhat decrease the meaning that our job is, and sometimes, again, this kind of seems kind of paradoxical in the conversation that we're having right now, but almost saw it as a means to an end, and not necessarily of, oh, this is me, my job is me. Would that also help our mental welfare and improve our self-esteem?
I think you're absolutely bang on with that, because there is an element where you look at, say, for example, Martin Seligman, who is the author of Flourishing, and he really is sort of the pioneer in positive psychology and this idea of what is important and how do you have a life that is happy? What is a happy life? And he came up with this acronym called Perma, which is essentially positive sort of thinking. So you tend to be optimistic? Do you think that plans sort of work out okay, even if you hadn't expected them to, or you have a bit of emotional flexibility? The E is engagement. So you feel engaged in your life, and that doesn't need to be work, but it can be work just as such a huge portion of our lives that engagement, helps if we can feel it at work or otherwise. Relationships are the most fundamental. They're the ones that increase our lifespan. They make us, I always say you can't drag the U-Haul behind the hearse. You don't come with your titles. You don't come with your, you don't come with your stuff. You come with people that attend your funeral because you were meaningful in their lives and they cared about you. That's what you really care about on your deathbed, is what relationships you formed. And then, do you have meaning, in what you do? Is there a sense of meaning and purpose in what you do? And every day, do you feel a sense of accomplishment? So this distinction around what is a happy person and how you have a happy life, work really does intersect with a lot of those things and what we do in the day. But if we're finding that in other places and we're figuring out a way to combine all of those aspects, and we don't require it in the same way from work, then I think that's healthy. And I do think that we need to look at harmonious versus obsessive passion when it comes to work, which is even more really interesting research. But when we have harmonious passion about work, that means we're healthy, we're still sustaining our relationships, we're enjoying what we do. It does need to meet our identity, because often when we have identity associated with work, it becomes obsessive passion. It becomes the inability to disconnect from it. It means that we can't leave it at the end of the day, and we are thinking about it the minute we wake up. And so there's this sort of perfect ideal place for us to be, where we're connected to what we do in the day and we feel like there's value. And that can be anything that we do. We see so many people, that are in waste management, from, CEOs to those people that are, doing the jobs that we might think are the worst jobs on the planet. And they love what they do because it's just that they feel that they're contributing. And so it's more about, making your day feel like there was some purpose, or that there was some reason for it. And if we're contributing just by contributing, or if we're just making a paycheck to pay for other things that also make us, happy, or we find other ways to feel meaning and accomplishment. And that can be spirituality, that can be religion, that can be altruism, that can be volunteering. As long as there's sort of that good, well-rounded way that we live our lives, work can play a role, or it doesn't need to, but we can utilize and leverage work to give us some of those things that lead to a life well lived.
What I hear also from what you're articulating, Jen, is the importance of having like a strong sense of self. Whether you have a difficult day at work or a difficult week, or whether your job is considered by some to be, lesser or for whatever. But if you have a strong sense of who you are, that can't really affect you as much. And I read an article you read, or you read, I read an article that you had written recently about dealing with grief in the workplace. And I was really struck by it because you highlighted the importance of allowing the person in grief to be able to express themselves authentically, which often isn't the case in work. But it did make me ponder whether you think, and can we really be ourselves at work? Can we always be our authentic selves at work? Or do we always have to be able to cut off a little bit of ourselves?
That's an interesting question, because I think the desire is to be our most authentic selves. And what we're finding from the research and data is the more authentic and psychologically safe we are, the happier we are in our workplaces. And that's why, cultural fit, I don't like that word fit. It's a weird word, but I think that when we do feel what I call effortless state of belonging, around certain people and inside of our workplaces, it's a very special feeling to have, where you just get to be who you are. It makes the experience so much better. But I mean, we all wear different hats in different parts of our life. I always say, the LinkedIn version of me versus the Facebook version of me is very different, right? And you're sort of, where you let yourself be most intimate and open. I think that's okay for us to have different versions of ourselves in a way that still stays authentic to who we are. However, the organizations where we're completely not ourselves, where we feel just that lack of openness to be even part of ourselves, is where we see a lot of burnout. And we're watching that in just people that that feel like introverts, for example, there's a whole other way of creating space and environment for someone who is an introvert. Susan Cain's book Quiet is so remarkable, and it really analyzes, the ways that we need to think about different types of personalities inside of groups where we're all married. It's like high school. It's very interesting where we're asking everyone to be to get along in these workplaces. And yet there's going to be different dynamics for different people. So it's why Gallup went from asking, do you have a best friend at work? And then found, in their Q12, they asked, do you have a best friend at work? And when they found that someone had a best friend, it completely changed the experience of work. Even 41% reduction in burnout, 57% more likely for you to receive praise. Promotions were increased if you had one best friend at work. All of these, they play a huge role in our well-being. There was less absenteeism, less truism. There was just a bunch of, really great data from that. But then they changed it over and said, you have close friends at work. And it wasn't the same as having one. All of the data changed, and it wasn't as important as having just one person that you are psychologically safe with, that you can talk to, that you can be yourself with. So again, in workplaces where we're asking for it to be that everyone is best friends and that everyone, obviously we need to have professional respect for each other and, not be rude or mean. There shouldn't be bullying. I mean, that's just standard. But you don't need to go and have a whole bunch of relationships at work. Having one really close friend and having a manager that understands that that's actually more beneficial to someone than having a whole bunch of, necessary to have the team building exercise where everyone gets along, that it's about one close friend. Then we can start to think about how we improve community at work, because lack of community is a high predictor of burnout. And so if we have better community, which could mean just one person, I say it's the person that you don't need to test, but if you had to, they would pick you up at 2 a.m. from the airport, or would bail you out of jail if you needed, take you out of the drunk tank if you needed it, that kind of friend. You never have to test it, but you want to know that person, if it was really, really necessary, they could do that for you. And so I think we need that. We need to foster just more, just close relationships with one person, and then that would make us allowed to be more of our authentic selves in the workplace.
You mentioned that the well-being or the well-being that we are feeling since the pandemic, since there's a huge move towards working at home, has decreased. Do you think that this is one of the contributing factors, the kind of inability to really connect? I mean, it's just Zooms and Zoom calls. It's just not the same as being able to be with someone.
Absolutely. It's part of our genetic history. It's part of our biology. I mean, if you were on the savannas and you were alone, you would get eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. But if you were on the savannas and you had a tribe, you were safe, or safer. And that's still part of our imprint as humans. We need to connect with each other. We need to connect in real life. I know that Seb has mentioned that his organization has moved from, remote full time. And so I actually think that there needs to be a hybrid approach to this, where there is time where we connect with people, at least, once a quarter or once a month, where we go in and meet our team in person, because we don't get the same actual neural activities and neural chemistry that is what makes us feel tied. So mirror neurons are part of how we interact, right? I need to mimic your behavior to show you that I'm safe. I get along with you. Bring me into your tribe. We can form an alliance. If you don't have that, that subconscious sort of neurochemistry working, where we're not creating that bonding chemistry, then what happens is it atrophies. We start to synaptically prune that, and that means that dies off in us. And so humans still need to see each other in person. And again, you can get that in other ways, with friendships outside of work. But when you're trying to form relationships with people at work, you do need to at least see them once. And what technology has done is it's replaced relationships instead of augmented them. And we found that, again, through research, that if you just meet someone in person, you can have a long-standing relationship with them and through technology, because you have had that personal interaction. It makes it better. I mean, I have lots of friends that I've only known through email and professional relationships that I've only known through video conferencing. So I know you can still have those connections, but there is something special about meeting that person in person and then having that relationship sustained through technology. So I believe that it's going to swinging the pendulum too far to have work from home forever. Sort of policies built in without looking at the hybrid options for those that want to be able to interact with people in person in office.
Jen, you spoke about the COVID and how I wonder if for you it's almost been like a perfect kind of case study in a way, because all of these companies, I said, like, you use my example there, and the CEO of my company is not from my generation. He's old school, and he says that himself. And if it wasn't for COVID, we would have never even have been allowed to work from home for a couple of days a week, let alone full time. And it's only because we were forced into the issue. He then saw it worked. Then you have the added benefits of no office costs and blah, blah, blah. And before you know it, now, like you said, the pendulum swung the whole other way. I wonder, are there any takeaways that you've seen from this massive swing in the way that most of us are working due to COVID that are either good, bad, and stuff that we can either learn from or that we can just take forward once we kind of go back to normality?
Well, what we found is that certain groups are enjoying the shift, but for the most part, people are really missing the opportunities to have serendipity, at work, where you just walk by someone in the office and talk about their kids, or you catch up on things. It could be a few minutes. People are just missing that sort of professional intimacy where you connect, and so. Especially, and there's some new data that was very interesting, and some research that was done about specifically high performers really wanting to go back. It was upwards of 74% of them said that they wanted to go back, that they were really missing the office. And 90% of that study said that they wanted a hybrid. And so I think that is really what people want right now. As a workplace expert for the last decade, I've been screaming how good working from home is and how we need to have flexible options. And it's extremely important for us to have that ability for people, if they want to work from home, that they can. And so here we are, and I'm still saying I want flexible options, which means that people are working from home all the time need to be able to get into the office. So we can't have it just one environment or the other environment. It really needs to be that it's inclusive, and it's thinking about those extroverts that actually only physically get, the sort of energy from interacting with other people. So I know personally, I look at my spouse he leads a team. He's at the C level of an organization, and he is missing that so much. He has been going back once a week, and he did mention that it's a lot more work to get ready, and he forgot how hard it is to actually get dressed and go in the car and drive somewhere, and it's kind of a pain. But when you get in the office and you see people, it's like, oh, I forgot how much I missed that. So it really shouldn't be all or nothing. It's just going back to the same pre-COVID rules, and they're not flexible. So, understanding that well-being is different for different people, and needs are different for different people. So it's about figuring out, okay, do you want to be in the office twice a week? Do you want to not be at all because you love working from home and that's excellent for you and you're really productive? Or do you want to be back full time because that's really good for you? And that would be the ideal. That would be where we should get to. And, often when a pendulum swings really, far in one direction, it does sort of make its way back. So I do see that normalization. But what I do think has been really great is for organizations where they have bosses like yours said, where they're saying, I'm old school, and all of a sudden they were forced into it. And now they're like, okay, well, I can be new school, on this. And that's actually been a really good byproduct of the pandemic, is just that forced social experiment, that workforce experiment that taught a lot of people that we can be really effective working from home. And so, both options are really, really still good for the success of the organization.
I wonder, Jim and I were speaking just before we started recording, and in the UK and in Jim's experience as well, there's been a kind of a movement towards like hub staff and programs like that, which to me feels insidious, having never used it, and if my bosses try to implement it, I mean, there's not much I could do, I guess, but I won't be best pleased, let's put it that way. And I wonder, do you think that there's that this opportunity to improve has also actually provided some bosses the opportunity to exploit even further? And because Jim expressed before we start recording, that the kind of the ethos in his job was, well, if you're at home, you're not work. What else have you got to do but work? So then, instead of it being an 8-hour day, it's now a 12-hour day. You've got the hub staff thing, which literally just feels like, I don't know, 1984 George Orwell type vibes. And does that worry you?
Absolutely. I'm cautioning why we're still behaving like we're an emergency. I mean, we went from these acute solutions. I get it. We are using Zoom because we need to connect, and managers were terrified that if they didn't see, their employees, that they probably are working, and there was a lot of control stuff that was happening at the beginning, and just holding on to culture. And there was a lot of leaders that were just, they had no frame of reference. So it's fair that they kind of were throwing a lot of things at the wall to see what stuck as far as, team building and connecting everyone. But we're over a year in, and we're still behaving like this is an acute situation, and it's not. And there's some organizations that have made absolutely fundamental strategic shifts where you are going to be working from home, and that means that's long term. So we can't just keep acting like it's the first 3 weeks of the pandemic lockdown. And I think that's what this digital interfacing it with each other all day is like. We're still stuck in March 15th, where everyone went into lockdown. In my previous book, I wrote about the walk and talk, and how some of the most amazing ideas and innovations came from people getting on a phone and going for a walk while they talked about these ideas. Because when you look at the brain walking versus looking at the brain sitting, it's like it's lit up like a Ferris wheel over here versus this. It's not. And so what we're doing is we're sitting in front of a computer. It's sedentary, so we're not even moving. So now we're all getting unhealthy. We sit all day. We're looking at each other on the screen, which actually makes us feel aggravated. Our cortisol goes up by constantly looking at our own face and other people's faces that are strangers to us. There's so much wrong with all of this digital interaction, and yet it's just become technology deciding for us. There's this great, and I watched The Office, the US version of it, and Steve Carell is like in his car, and his GPS is telling him to drive into the lake, and he's like, but it's the lake, and the GPS is like, keep driving. And so he drives into the lake because his GPS told him. I feel like that's Zoom right now. Zoom's telling us to just drive into the lake, and we can't stop it because we're so in control. It's holding us hostage. We need to do way better about, just controlling that. Like, anybody that's running a meeting should say, is this meeting necessary? Do all of these people have to be on this meeting? Can I make it 30 minutes? Does it need to be an hour because Zoom only gives us the hour to be on calls? Anyone that needs to get off 10 minutes early because they have back-to-back Zoom meetings, absolutely, no questions asked, jump off. Do you need to put on your video camera? No, you shouldn't have to put on your video camera. And then, can we make this a good old-fashioned phone call? Like, why does it have to actually be an interface this way? Get on a call and go for a walk. You can do a lot of really great, learning and conversationalizing and bonding with your employees in that same way. So we really have to you have to get off of this, driving into a lake modality and rethink where we're at, because I kind of see this next 2 years as recovery. I've been calling it the recovery period because it's not going to be just go back to normal or business as usual. It's about recovering from what we went through. And there's going to be a lot to recover from. And part of that will be moving from this acute emergency mode of working to long-term sustainable well-being at the core kind of planning and practice. And I think what's happening is we're just sort of continuing to fall into the patterns and not questioning why we're still doing what we're doing.
I love that you said. Sorry, John. I love that you said that we can walk and talk, because my girlfriend, she goes nuts when I walk around the house or I go for a walk and I have a chat with my friends. And now I've got scientific backup there to explain my odd behaviours. And you've also maybe gone into what my favourite guest with your US office example there. So, but just before I let Jim get in there, I wanted to you talk about the recovery and almost the future that we're going to see. And I was just talking to Jim before, and we were saying how like our grandparents / the people who maybe 50, 60-year-olds now, their kind of way of seeing things was you get in base job, you work your way up, and you get given a watch when you retire. And then I was saying that our parents, maybe they still see themselves in the corporate structure, but they were allowed to kind of have more jobs within that structure, right? So my mum and dad, they've both changed jobs a few times, but they were always in the same sector. But and I was saying that I think that the way that, at least from our projects and the way our friends, everyone I know seems to have a side project that they would love to grow into a full-time thing, or many side projects. And I was just telling Jim beforehand that I saw a tweet saying, kind of said what Gen Zs want to be for their job. And the first two options were YouTuber, I don't know, have a 50%, blogger 24%, and then kind of more traditional jobs, doctor, so on and so forth. And the person who tweeted this was a Gen X, and they were like, oh, our generation's done such a poor job at inspiring the younger generation, like this is what happens. And then someone quote tweeted that and said, it's almost as if the younger generation has seen that working 9 till 5 days a week for 50 years of your life for a company that don't care about you isn't the way to go. And I wonder, and we talked about agency beforehand, do you think that younger people are going to try to take more agency and have these side projects and think, well, you know what, maybe instead of having a job that pays me 40 or 50,000, I can have 4 different projects that get me 10,000 each, and I'm my own boss there. Because I remember when COVID happened, and I'm sure a lot of people felt this way. My boss was very frank with us, and he said, "Look, this is going to be real tough, and I don't know if we're going to make it through the first 3 months of this. If we do, we should be fine. But these first 3 months are going to be real sketchy." And when he said that, there was an immediate sense of panic for 2 reasons. Obviously, because I'm going to potentially lose my job, but more than that was because I could do nothing about it. It was completely in the CEO's hands and whatever measures he decided to take. But there was nothing I could do to help that situation. And I felt real helpless there. And I thought to myself, I don't want to be here again if I can help that. So do you think that maybe younger people are going to start moving away from the traditional way that we see careers unfolding?
Yeah, I love what you just said, because there's so many points that resonate. First, my father was in banking, and he actually started his first job at the bank. He was sweeping it, and then he ended up being the vice president and retired in the same bank with the gold watch, the whole thing, right? And there was loyalty at the time, but at the end, he had so many regrets. He said he wished he had been a carpenter his whole life, and so, there's a really and it's probably why I'm so, entrepreneurial. And whereas my mom was a nurse practitioner, which is sort of much more entrepreneurial, and she had her own, setup and stuff. And then at around 30 years into nursing, she quit her job and opened up a quilt store. I mean, it was just told us she was not going to be a nurse anymore, and she was going to start this quilting store. And, we were like, okay, that's fine. And I think I saw her as that person that said, I don't want to die with my gold watch. I want to have choice. I just want to change. This isn't making me happy. And so I sort of followed that model. And I think we're seeing a lot of people right now that are pursuing a more entrepreneurial path. And it is because there's much more opportunity. We're in a global workforce where we have access through technology to different buyers and to different consumers. So it's easier than maybe our parents, when they were younger, to even be able to do that. But there is there's a lot of talk around the side hustle being what you can do for a living. And I think too, what's so interesting when you talk about is this actually, something we're seeing in our last global policy happiness report. We looked at data that showed that millennials and Gen Zs would take 37% less pay to do something that made them happy and feel connected to what they were doing. And that could mean their side hustles. Like 37% less pay is significant, but you have control over that, and that you are, running your own ship. And with so many young people now deciding that the cost of university is just too prohibitive, and going to some of these schools are just not necessarily giving them the kind of advantage that they think that they're going to get. There's a lot of reasons why this is happening. And even just the fact that you could go and get your master's and you're still a barista at Starbucks, and that's probably what you're going to be for 10 years, and that's making you not happy. You can't pay your bills. So why not say, okay, I might do something that's a trade, or I might get some better video software, college diploma that can teach me what I actually can tactically do. And that is showing that is actually going to make you more money. And all the data is showing that that's the case. Like we're showing that those Yale and Harvard degrees, are so, and we push for them. They're really important. And yet at the same time, there's also, there's also very selective in who gets to really benefit from that. And I think all of us need to really understand, okay, what do we want to do? What is the education that supports what we want to do? And instead of thinking that we have to follow the social construct, think about what is going to make us enjoy what we do in the day. And if it's podcasting, we can go now to a college and get a podcasting diploma that teaches us how to actually make our own podcast. I mean, the amount of schooling that serves every single thing that we want to do is I think a testimony to what is going to be what we're going to see in the future of work.
Jen, you're dropping so many gems here, and I'm already looking forward to re-listening to this. But also, I'm sure there are listeners who are going, Jim and Seb, you're talking to a burnout expert here, and you still haven't talked about how to help me out of this burnout that I'm experiencing. So, in your words, what are your key kind of points for someone who says, yeah, I'm resonating with so much of what you're saying. What can I do? And I guess the follow question would be is how much is it in the hands of the worker, and how much do we need a boss like Seb or a kind of well-being focused organization?
It's a really great question. I think what is important is first, how do I identify if I'm burning out? And, I like to use the Maslow burnout inventory. That's a scale, that's an academic scale that really does help. I mean, and I'm going to simplify it here because it's a little bit more complex than that. But basically, we like to look at the frequency of feeling certain, feelings each day. And to identify if we're burnt out, the more we feel, like say we measure it per week, how often you feel this way. And if you're exhausted at the end of the day, to the point where you feel like you have to take a nap, or you're not focused and you're losing clarity, the more frequently you feel that way, that level of exhaustion, the more likely you're burning out. The more frequently you dread going to work on Monday, the more frequently you feel exhausted waking up in the morning and really struggling to motivate, the more exhausted you feel in the middle of the day where you just can't get your work done. And it's taking you more time to burn those calories. So that's one stage. And then there's the cynicism stage, which is the most clear. And that starts to make you even more at risk of burnout. So how frequently you feel cynical, which means how frequently do you feel like you don't have control over this? You have no agency. This is going to be like this forever. I don't see a way out of this. Those types of feelings. We saw a lot of increase in cynicism in our data this year, but a lot of that had to do with, racial injustice and polarization and, women for being pushed out of the maternal labor force. I mean, those types of things really impact our levels of cynicism, which is part of a social construct too. So you've got to think about, do I feel exhausted? That makes sense from a pandemic standpoint, and just we're really tired. This is a really tiring time. We're chronically stressed. But am I feeling like this is never going to change? And that's when you really have to worry, okay, where am I at and when should I make a decision? Often inside of organizations too, we misdiagnose someone's performance issues as being, or we misdiagnose chronic stress and burnout as performance issues. And so managers will just think, okay, well, that person is showing up late or leaving early or is disengaged or withdrawing. So it probably means I have to put them on a plan to let them go because it's performance based, where it's often not. It's often chronic stress that underlines all of this, especially if an employee has been really strong and all of a sudden it's atypical of them and they're not performing. I mean, we should be asking, where did that happen? How did that happen? And so that's really important too. I think from our own standpoint, I'm a person, and I've had to be in this role for a long time, where I am my own employer. And so I have responsibilities to my employee, which is me. And we need to do a better job of, like stepping out of that. How do I want to model the behavior for my employee? And it's hard to do that when you are an individual contributor, or you're a person that's an entrepreneur, you're on your own, or it is your side hustle that you've made your job, that we're seeing a lot of young people start to do. And even in the workforce, leaders tend to be very stoic. They don't do a good job of modeling that behavior. We need to step outside and say, okay, am I walking the walk? Am I following my own rules? Am I taking breaks in the day? We've added 48 minutes to our workday, which is astronomical. And we've increased our number of meetings by 24%. Women are actually working 20 more hours per week, which is the equivalent of a part-time job. And that is in the pandemic, this data, that's just massive. And so when you think about how much more work that is, we need to be able to reflect on what our goals are every day. Are we creating false emergencies on things we think our boss wants us to do or needs from us? Are we deprioritizing things and prioritizing things, and we don't really know what our boss wants from us or our manager wants from us? But if we are individual contributors, we need to be able to also say, why is that so important that has to happen right now? I've had these hacks where I have which you might have seen, my out of office response. I'm very clear about what I can do and what I can't do, how soon I'm going to get back in touch with you. If I need to block off chunks of time for writing, I'll actually create an out of office that says I'm in, flow time, I'm in heads down time for the next 4 hours. If I don't answer your email, I will get back to you. It's really about managing other people's expectations of you. And people will stop, pushing you to answer their emails if they've got this out of office reply that says, I'm just heads down. I'll get back to you this afternoon. Use technology for good. Blackout time. I have blackout time in my calendar that says writing time, and it doesn't get booked. And it's so easy to be like, oh, well, this is a false urgency. I put this writing time in, but it can be deprioritized. If it's in your calendar, if you committed to it, it shouldn't be moved. And that's what we need to start doing as individuals, is making sure that we're setting those boundaries around our time. When I was speaking in the research for the book, I spoke with Dr. Marie Asberg, and she's in Sweden. And it's the only place that burnout is considered a medical, is actually, there's pharmacological treatment for it. And, there's programs that support it. They call it extreme exhaustion disorder, but it's burnout. And what she told me is that too often we live to our margins. We actually write into the margins of our lives, which I love this idea of it. If we have a lined paper, there's these margins on the side that are supposed to be those spaces that we give ourselves. If there's room for error, we can write in them when we're really stressed, but we live within these margins so that, we have space. But we just write all the way across the page, and we just fill our lives with things that we think we need to, because it's the space in that 24-hour cycle or that 7-day work week. We need to start to think differently about the space and the priority of that space, and to give ourselves the ability that when there is stress, that we can tackle it without completely falling apart. And that's how we're going to prevent systemic burnout, and that's how we're going to prevent burnout in ourselves.
That's fantastic, Jen. I appreciate it. This is so helpful for me just listening to it right now. I'm sure a lot of listeners are going to feel the same. Um, like the two-part question before we finish is, I was thinking this morning about this call, and I said, I really want to ask Jen, is it difficult for her sometimes, because she is a burnout expert and a happiness and work expert? Is it difficult for her sometimes to kind of live through all of this knowledge that she is just soaking in, that she's aware of? Is it, because you seem like you're doing a great job of it with with what you're saying before. But I just wanted to know that. And I guess the follow on question is, what we always ask is, how do you look after your mental health?
So really great questions. And, I have probably why I wanted to write this book and focused on the research about 5 years ago is that, as a female startup founder, which is a very, underfunded, difficult place to be as a tech startup founder, as a woman, I burned out. And I noticed it when I lost, healthy relationships. I was withdrawing. Even my close circle of relationships were faltering. I was obsessive about the passion. I was so married to the idea that it didn't matter that we were poor and we were constantly broke, and and there was so much financial stress all the time. But because of this idea that I was it was so important to pursue that idea, I lost sight of that, and then instantly it was like, that's it. And when you look at the research, what happens is you kind of go for 18 months or 2 years or whatever. And then when you actually burn out, you fall off a cliff, you break off that cliff. And so that was really what had happened. And so all of a sudden I had to, it was me leave the company, kind of end that role. Stopped being on all the boards I was on. I actually took a good 4 months away and regrouped. And I think that was a moment where I realized that's how catastrophic it can get, where you can lose everything because you are not doing the things that you need to do. And so that really led me to understand why certain roles and professions are more burned out. One of my first big articles for HBR was happiness is not the absence of negative emotions. And so going through that was understanding that happiness is part of a journey of resiliency, and having that ability to have post-traumatic growth out of a time of trauma and stress. And I think that that's what this last year is going to tell a lot of us, is actually we're developing these amazing skills, from optimism to gratitude to emotional flexibility and resilience, because we've gone through this collective trauma together, really. And most of us have really weathered this very painful impact on our mental health as a collective, which creates empathy. So I understanding all of that and knowing that happiness also means unhappiness made it so that this became a different kind of mission. But I wanted to do that in a way that was really sustainable, that said, I learned from this experience and now I'm going to make sure that I model a totally different scenario. So I take a walk for an hour every single day, which seems, quote unquote, frivolous, right? I walk for an hour in the forest every day with my dog. I take breaks. I put space in my calendar. Every single day, I put space in my calendar. I say no to things. And I don't like that in the office where it's about employees just saying no. I don't think that works there. And that's a very privileged and biased place to say, hey, just tell your boss no. But when it comes to you, and you're running the ship, you have the authority to say no, and not have put false urgencies on things. So, I do walk the walk now. And I think it's really important. Are there times where I feel fatigued? Are there times where I know, okay, maybe I'm pressing it? Are there times where I feel like at the end of the week, I've maybe booked up my calendar a little bit too heavy? Yes. And in the middle of a pandemic, when I was homeschooling my 3 kids, and I was humiliated to know that I know nothing about any of their subjects, even my grade 2 child was humiliating me, and that she knew more than I did. Those are the moments where you're like, okay, I'm a little beat up here. This is a lot. So we all will go through them. The whole point of being a model for burnout is saying, I know when I'm hitting those points. and I pull back and I give myself space. And so it's important too for me to say there's no right way to feel right now. And so those days where I was demotivated and I had brain fog and I felt like the dishwasher was my enemy and I was tired of doing it, unloading and loading it for the 10th time that day, I let it go and I put on Netflix and I wore my baggy, sweatpants that I love, and I let go to it. And I think we do need to have moments where we cut the guilt, and there's a lot of self-compassion and grace that we need to give ourselves this year in particular.
Jen, it's been absolutely fantastic to have you on. It's been real great stuff. For people who've listened and you've really whet their appetite, where can you said your book's coming out soon? What's it called, and where can they find it when it is out?
It's called The Burnout Epidemic, appropriately named, The Rise of Chronic Stress and How We Can Fix It. And that's available for pre-sale now on Amazon and all the other places. It'll be available on Audible and all those other places soon. You'll be able to find me, just if you want to go and find out what I write about and et cetera. You can go to my website at jennifer-moss.com.
Perfect. We'll put all of those links in the show notes. So for anyone who wants to find out more about Jennifer herself or the book, they'll all be there. Easy for you guys to find. Just want to thank you once again for having you. It's been real great stuff.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a really good conversation. You guys are excellent at what you do. So if this is a side hustle, you should probably make it your full time.
There we go, Jim. We've heard it from the expert herself. There we go.